So Dr. Bassamer and I saw in each other kindred spirits. Two women of similar age working with the military. And as she said, military men are very difficult. So we understood that the different groups in Iraq were competing for power and resources. And we both believed that the only way to end the violence was through reconciliation, and that most groups could be brought into the process. Only the most extreme, the ones who wanted to collapse the nation state and create a caliphate, could not. So we helped our respective bosses, the general and the prime minister, reach agreements on the way ahead. And the Sunni awakening flourished, it expanded, turning against Al-Qaeda and bringing about a huge drop in casualty figures. Now, the surge was an extraordinary period. The US military changed its tactics to focus on population security, outreach to insurgents, and precise targeting of those deemed irreconcilable. The surge helped bring about a strategic shift in the calculus of the various groups. They stopped using violence. And the US military brokered ceasefires and truces between the competing groups. And we hoped that the elections in 2010 would produce a political settlement and power sharing that would set Iraq irreversibly on the path towards stability. So what went wrong? Why did it all unravel? Now, the turnout for the 2010 elections was high. Iraqis wanted to believe in the political process, and they were hopeful that they could move beyond sectarianism. They were really fed up with religious parties. And Iraqi, a coalition led by Ayad Alawi, who was a secular Shia, campaigned on a platform of no to sectarianism and Iraq for all Iraqis. And it attracted support from Iraq's Sunnis, secular Shia, and Iraq's minorities. And it won the most seats in the elections. Now, Maliki, the incumbent prime minister, refused to accept that he had lost the elections. He demanded a recount, and he used de-Baathification to try to disqualify the candidates of the winning bloc, Iraqi, and to annul their votes. And when that failed to give him victory, he further intimidated his rivals and pressured the judiciary to rule in his favor. So Maliki became so focused on his own survival that he was prepared to do anything to remain in power. Now, during this period, there were real differences within the US system over what to do. So General Odiano, my boss, believed that the US should uphold the right of the winning bloc to have first go at trying to form the government. He didn't believe that Alawi would succeed with himself as prime minister, but he thought it could lead to power sharing between Alawi and Maliki, or the selection of a third person to be prime minister. However, Vice President Joe Biden, following the advice of the US ambassador at the time, decided that the US should support the incumbent, Maliki, for a second term, believing that Maliki was a friend of the US, that he would give us a follow-on security agreement to keep US troops in country, and that he was an Iraqi nationalist. And Biden thought this was the quickest way to have the government in Iraq formed ahead of the US midterm elections. But Iraqi politicians had spent the previous 2 years trying to remove Maliki through a vote of no confidence in the parliament. They were fearful that he was turning into a dictator. And each time they tried to remove him, the US had intervened, saying, the security situation is too precarious. Don't change leadership at this time. wait until there's a national election. And in the region, people spoke about how Iran had driven the US out of Iraq and how the US had handed Iraq to Iran on a silver platter. And securing his seat for a second term, Maliki accused Sunni politicians of terrorism and drove them out of the political process. He reneged on his promises to the tribal leaders who had fought against al-Qaeda in Iraq. He arrested Sunnis en masse. He subverted the democratic institutions that were supposed to keep a check on his power. There were Sunni protests across Iraq, and these were violently crushed. And in such an environment, the Islamic State rose up out of the ashes of al-Qaeda in Iraq, claiming that it was the defender of the Sunnis against the government. And the Sunnis, who had previously contained al-Qaeda in Iraq with our support, determined that the Islamic State was the lesser of two evils when compared with the Iranian-backed sectarian regime of Maliki. When I went back to Iraq in the summer of 2014, just after ISIS had swept into Mosul, I met with a number of insurgents. And these are the guys with big moustaches, not the ones with the beards. I wouldn't be here today if they'd been bearded ones, but the moustached ones. And I heard lots of stories. I heard stories of how the Iraqi army, which had greatly outnumbered ISIS and in which the US had invested billions, had fled, leaving behind all their US-supplied equipment. Because Maliki had replaced leaders who he feared were too close to the US with people loyal to him. And they had pocketed the funds that were supposed to be used to buy ammunition and food for the soldiers. And they're not given any orders to their troops to fight. And the insurgents I spoke to said, this is a broad Sunni rebellion. We're going to use ISIS to overthrow Maliki, and then we're going to turn against ISIS. And I told them they're completely deluded. So we should never have invaded Iraq in 2003. But nothing that happened in Iraq after 2003 was inevitable. There were hopes of a world without Saddam Hussein's and missed opportunities to create a better order. We have seen the unintended consequences of our action and of our non-action. And we remain so traumatized by what happened in Iraq that we have stood by while mass murder has taken place in Syria. 250,000 Syrians are now dead, and over half the population displaced from their homes. It had been announced that Sunni was going to be the new ambassador. And he'd been told he was going to be the ambassador, and at the last moment he hears in the media that it's somebody else. Individuals really do matter. And Ambassador Crocker, I think, is one of the greatest ambassadors that America's had for the last period. He's superb. Not only is he a brilliant expert on the Middle East, he also understands how to work with the military. And as I said before, military people are not always easy. But he knew which battles to pick, and he knew the value of that partnership. It's important internally, and it's also important in the eyes of the Iraqis. They must see us as seamless. Now he left, and there must have been 4 or 5 months without any ambassador. And then we were sent an ambassador who had no regional experience, didn't want to be there, was going through a divorce, had his own personal crisis. And one of the first things he did was to get rid of, in the embassy, anybody who knew anything about Iraq, because he just felt threatened by their knowledge. So Ambassador Robert Ford, who had stayed on to serve as his deputy, Ford, who'd, Arabist, been ambassador in Algeria, went on to be ambassador in Syria, one of the best ambassadors. Hill got rid of him very early on. And he wanted to be the guy. He wanted to get rid of the military, he wanted to be the man. And so relations between the military and the civilians really deteriorated. Relations with the Iraqis went down. And the results were, as I said. So these appointments really are critical. And unfortunately, that was one of the very worst appointments, with devastating consequences for the country. A different ambassador at that time would have handled the 2010 elections differently, would have given different advice to Joe Biden. And if you think of all those things if those things had happened, then there would have been a political agreement in Iraq after the elections. There would have been no chance of ISIS rising up. The situation in Syria today would be so different. Paris attacks might never have happened. So all of these knock-on things might never have happened.